Okay, so I'm here today with Trond Sigurdsen from Norway, or from LA via Norway. Thanks for joining me today, Trond. And so first of all, we're going to talk a bit about Norwegian Tarok. Do you want to give us some background, first of all, how you got interested in researching tarot games, or the Norwegian Tarok game in particular?
Yeah. As you say, I'm originally from Norway. Did my PhD in Canada. Now I live in LA. Uh, and I've always been a little bit interested in gaming. Not very competitive, really, but a little bit gaming on the side. I'm kind of fascinated by card games. We played card games when I was a kid. And then I got into role-playing games. And I've had some groups of role-playing games both in Norway and Canada, and for a while here as well. And then I had this idea for making a role-playing game where you use, normally you use dice in role-playing games, or as sort of a random factor. But there are a few games that use cards, and I was thinking, how about using tarot cards? I think there was a friend of mine who suggested it first. Although the thought may have sort of occurred to me a couple of times, but originally I didn't know anything about tarot cards. So I started looking into it, a little bit on the rules and history and so on, and I found it quite fascinating. So at a certain point, I read that the northernmost part of tarot card games in Europe was in Denmark, Danish Tarok. And then I was thinking that it's strange it never, occurred in Norway. So I looked it up in an encyclopedia. And there was an entry there where it was spelled a little bit different from Danish with two Ks, which is kind of how you would spell it in Norwegian. And it seemed to talk about Tarok or Tarok in a way that made you assume that it was played in Norway as well, although it didn't really say it specifically. It's just a very short paragraph. So I started looking into it, and took a while though. None of my friends had ever heard of it. So I assumed it had died out if it was ever played in Norway at all. And but eventually it was actually by going through the National Library of Norway that really gave me a gold mine of literature to go through. And it turns out there are quite a few references to Tarok and Tarok players in Norway in the 1800s primarily, but also some interesting notes on the game in the early 1900s.
So with Tarok in Norway, so obviously because I've profiled Danish Tarok on my YouTube channel, and we've played Danish Tarok online before, you and I.
Right.
What are the main differences in the game itself from what you've found researching Norwegian Tarok?
Well, they follow each other very closely, and that was something I was kind of expecting. So I did find a Norwegian rule set from the 1830s, and it's very similar to Danish Tarok at that time. But the bonuses for taking the last trick with the pagat is actually a little bit higher. Which is kind of interesting because that's a kind of a trend you see a little bit later in Denmark. Becomes a very big deal in that game. It was sort of already something they focused on, but it definitely was not the sort of only way to win, or not even the main way maybe, but it was definitely a big bonus there, and it was a little bit larger in the Norwegian rules. Of course, I'm not sure how everybody played the game. It's possible that some Danish people played it exactly the same as in Norway at the same time. There were definitely many sort of local variants out there, but when you're looking at the published rules, taking the last trick with a Pagat and with a king, by the way, that was mentioned as an option, and that's true in Danish rules as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's and they sort of, I mean, both of those rules sort of crop up in different Tarot games around Europe, you know, in different levels.
Right.
Some have it and some, I mean, most have the Pagat as Ultimo bonus. Not all of them have the King Ultimo bonus. Right. But it is interesting how that's spread around. So, I mean, from your research, so obviously because Danish is the last example, as far as people understand, the last example of Course Tarok that still exists. Yeah. Well, in your research, how did you sort of find in terms of the origins of Norwegian Tarok? Was it imported by the Danes, or was it even a case of the Norwegians bringing it to Denmark rather than the other way around? And where did they sort of get this game from in the first place?
Well, the earliest reference I could find to Tarok in Norway was a reference to the Danish rules. As far as I can tell, I'm almost certain that they're talking about the Danish rules of 1786, I believe. And that was being sold in Norway at the time. Hey, here comes my dog. So if that was the introduction of the game in Norway, not 100% sure, but that's the earliest reference I've found, at least. After that, you see Norwegian gaming books, so sort of kind of similar to the publications in Denmark, but definitely not identical. And so originally they seem to have been using Danish rules. Then in the 1800s, it became quite popular in Norway, and they had kind of their own variant in Norway, and also included an example of one full hand in the Norwegian rules that they didn't include in the Danish rules.
Okay.
And then later on, they seem to have gone back to emphasizing the Danish rules. It became sort of more specialized in Norway in the early 1900s. Probably because the normal deck of cards, 52 cards, there are so many games you can play with that deck.
Yeah.
So most people had those lying around. Tarok was sort of more specialized, mostly for people who were really into card games. And they really started studying the Danish rules. There were several sort of specialized publications in Denmark at the time. So they went back to Danish rules at that time. But by that time, the Danes had an enormous emphasis on taking the last trick, particularly with a Pagat or a king.
Yeah, that's the thing
people
people
do today.
Yeah. So in terms of the cards that were used, did you find any literature mentioning exactly where they were getting the cards from? But this is an interesting question for me, only because I've read elsewhere that for a lot of games after World War II, a lot of these traditional tarot and tarot games tended to die out, partly because people couldn't find where to get cards.
Yeah.
So just curious, did you find who were the card manufacturers that they were using back then?
I'm actually not sure. I found very little reference to the actual cards. I'm assuming they were Danish at first. There was one reference to use of French cards. I can't remember exactly who mentioned that, but I think French were also quite common.
Presumably the Tarot Nouveau, like the French tarot is, yeah.
And then the Danes also switched to using French cards.
They did.
So yeah, I think towards the end, towards World War II, it was mostly French cards, I'm guessing, but very few people actually mention it.
And so when does the history of Norwegian Tarok sort of peter out? What's the last mention? I think you've told me before you saw mentions in the 70s of people remembering it.
Yeah.
But when was the last time that you've seen people actually confirmed to be playing it?
One of the last references to the game actually being played is actually the article that I mentioned with Midsem, who's Anton Midsem, who's a famous player of bridge in Norway, and he also was very fond of Tarok, and he was a member of a group of players in probably in Drøbak.
Mm-hmm.
So they seem to have been going fairly strong into the 30s,
Mm-hmm.
but I couldn't find any references to the game actually being played after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And Midsem himself died in 47.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing during the war, probably it was almost impossible to find the decks of cards. Apparently, they were hard to find even before the war.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, as you mentioned, in the 70s, there were still people around who remembered the game, but nobody had played it for ages, apparently. So, and that was just something I found in a newspaper article of old timers. And at that time, they were mostly focused on bridge, playing bridge.
Yeah.
And they mentioned Tarokk as being equally difficult to really master and also a very fun game, but nobody remembers all the rules anymore.
Yeah, that's a common thing as well. You hear, yeah. And I think, I mean, I guess with bridge, because you've got such a large playing community worldwide, you've got lots of opportunities to play, and you're playing with a regular deck. Yeah. I can see how a lot of, and because, you know, you've got the tournament sort of tradition and everything, I can see how, yeah.
My grandparents too, they were into bridge. So it was like a big hype right before the war, I think, and it lasted until after the war. And because the war was such a devastating thing, I think, you know, more specialized games like Tarokk just died out. So anyway, that's the best I can find out at this point.
So in terms of the future of Norwegian Tarok, so I understand, so you're looking at reviving, at least on a social level, with some people in LA.
Yeah, I'm starting a group here. We'll see what happens with that. It's all very new. I have some members of the group we haven't gotten together yet. Of course, you've had all the trouble with COVID.
Yeah.
And such things. So we'll see what happens with that. I've also sent messages on Facebook with rules and all sorts of stuff to people in Norway, just in case they're interested. So we'll see what comes out of that. Would be cool if some people picks it up.
Yeah, definitely. If so your group in LA, are you specifically looking at a Norwegian Tarok group, or is this a group that may branch out into other games?
No, we're going to try all sorts of tarot card games. Some Italian ones and some from Austria, some Scandinavian style. So we'll try them all out.
Yeah, no, it sounds fantastic. I mean, I'll follow it along, and we'll see if you know, any of the guys that you're training up in LA want to join some of us when we have the tournaments with the guys from London and everything. Yeah, so hopefully we can sort of keep building the network of people out there playing tarot games and Tarokk games and Tarokko and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, it is an interesting tradition, I think.
Yeah.
And it's sort of an interesting deck of cards. It's slightly less sort of symmetric than the 52 sort of normal deck of cards, which kind of makes it interesting in its own way.
And I think it's definitely in the English-speaking world, because people only know tarot in the in the context of divination and that kind of thing. I find a lot of people get quite fascinated with the idea of tarot games just because they didn't realize they existed.
Exactly.
And then it sort of can build from there, because there's such a big varied family of traditional tarot games. There's a lot there for people to explore. So one last thing I wanted to ask you is, can you tell us about this poem that you found, which I'll link in the video as well?
Yeah, that was kind of interesting, and it just shows a little bit about how people were into it in Norway in the 1800s. It's actually not the only reference in sort of literature and poetry that I found, but so this is written by an author called Shavak. Kind of unusual name, but he was Norwegian. And he's talking about, the whole poem is about Tarokk, basically. And it's the name is Tarokk regler, which can either mean Tarokk rules or Tarokk rhyme. It can mean either way.
Yeah, sure.
And he actually goes through some of the elements of the game, even though you can't use it to actually play the game. But you know, he mentions taking the last trick with the pagat and things like that. So you know, and he also writes about it as sort of a very heroic fight, which is kind of cool.
I remember there's the line, it either starts or ends with hurrah for the little pagat, or hurrah for the good pagat. One of them is the good pagat. I can't remember which way around it was, but it was cute. My Norwegian is very, very limited, but I did read it. I found it quite intriguing just that the poem existed. That it actually had a cultural sort of position high enough that someone would bother writing a poem about it. I thought it was quite interesting. Yeah.
He was apparently very into card games. This poet, and particularly the Northern European version of Tarokk is sort of very exciting because of this focus on taking the last trick. So people get sort of worked up about it. And,
there's that tension that builds over. You know, working through 25 tricks until you finally circle in on the last thing. It's got that slow build to it, which I understand. I see why people get the guys who like it, why they get really excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was also mentioned briefly by some other authors. Jonas Lie is actually much more famous, sort of one of the golden age of literature in Norway. He also mentioned, you know, in one of his books, people getting together and playing Tarokk. So yeah, it was clearly very popular throughout the 1800s, I would say, and then a bit more specialized in the early 1900s.
Great. So if people want to read more of your work, do you want to tell us about, you had an article published recently?
Yes. So yeah, I actually have a magazine right here in the playing card. Oh, you can see it.
No, it's disappeared into your...
Anyway, yeah, so it's the playing card volume 49, number 4. It's a very interesting journal, I think. Very sort of focused on playing cards for people who are interested in that history and so on. And I wrote a little article there on Norwegian Tarokk, a little bit of history there, some of the variants of the rules and so on. So yeah, you can read more there.
But yeah, I haven't read it yet, but quite a few people from the Discord group and everything had read it and said it's really great. So I'll have to pick up a copy and check it out myself. Oh, great. Okay, well, thanks so much for joining me today and having the chat. And I hope to catch you. I hope to catch you online for a game. If you pester Mysterious, maybe he can add some of the Norwegian rule variants to Gross Tarokk on BGA as well, so you can get the authentic experience online as well of 19th century Norway.
A little bit simpler version, I would say, than the Danish, perhaps. So maybe it's a good introduction.
Sure, yeah, definitely. And all the best with your group in LA, and we hope that takes off there as well and spreads the word. So.
Thank you so much.
Oh, good.